Allan Lichtman, thanks so much for joining us. Polling guru and expert on particularly American elections. But actually, before we get to the tough bit, which is what's going to happen in a few weeks' time, tell me first about your model, how it works and how you built it. I believe it's connected to how we study earthquakes.
Remarkably, yes. My model avoids the pundits. I love them, but they have no scientific basis for predictions. It avoids the polls, which are snapshots, not predictors. And I'd love to tell you I developed the keys by ruining my eyes in the archives and deep contemplation. But if I were to tell you that, to quote the late, not so great Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. You're absolutely right. It had to do with earthquake prediction. In 1981, I was a distinguished visiting scholar at Caltech in Southern California, and there I met the world's leading authority in earthquake prediction, Vladimir Kailas-Borak from Moscow. And it was his idea, not mine, that we become the odd couple of political research, using the pattern recognition methodology that he used to connect patterns in the physical environment to earthquakes, to connect patterns in the political environment to election outcomes. So we looked at every American election from 1860 to 1980. Remember, this is 1981. And we conceptualized elections, not as Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan or Republican versus Democrat, but in earthquake terms as stability, the White House party keeps power, earthquake, they're booted out. And we used Kailas-Borak's method of earthquake prediction to scan all elections from 1860, when Abe Lincoln was elected, to 1980. And that empirical method determined that the pattern that best distinguished between stability and earthquake were what we now call the 13 keys to the White House, which gauge the strength and performance of the White House party. In other words, the keys have a big message, unlike the polls or the pundits, and that is it's governing, not campaigning, that counts. And we developed a simple decision rule. If 5 or fewer keys turned against the White House party, they're predicted winners. 6 or more, they're predicted losers. 6 strikes and you're out.
And using that model, since 1984, you have correctly predicted the results of 9 out of 10 presidential elections. Now, 2000 was the exception, but many people are still somewhat confused by the 2000 Al Gore victory and then non-victory during that incredibly tight election campaign. And then 2016, you predicted Donald Trump would win the popular vote victory, which he didn't actually, but he did, of
Incorrect.
course, win the
I've got to
electoral
stop you
college.
right there because stop, or I'm going to stop this interview. You are spreading misinformation. And, there has been this concerted campaign against me that started, by a couple of wannabe unknown journalists claiming I didn't predict Donald Trump's victory. That is an outright lie. I clearly, in my September 23rd Washington Post interview, said nothing about the popular vote, said Donald Trump was headed for a win, that in fact, I predict any generic Republican would win this election based on the keys against the White House party. And I predicted at the time that Donald Trump would be impeached, which made no sense if I wasn't predicting his win. I got a letter of congratulations from Donald Trump for predicting his win. I won the Steckler Award for Courage in Forecasting. The Dean of American Political Science, Gerald M. Pomper, recognized that I was stood virtually alone in predicting Donald Trump's win, completing my near perfect record of predicting election wins. Chris Cillizza, the editor of The Fix, said, when I look back at 2016, I come up with one thing: Allan Lichtman, who had the courage to predict Donald Trump's election when virtually no one was so doing. So somehow, a couple of unknowns have perpetrated these lies about what I predicted in 2016 just to make a name for themselves on my back. That's why I get so angry about this. 8 years after the fact, people are questioning what I clearly said in 2016.
Mr. Lichtman, it is very good that you've been able to say with such clarity how wrong that accusation has been. So I'm delighted that we've been able to have that conversation. So beyond,
Thank you. It's not only inaccurate, it's
yeah, that's
malicious.
really interesting. 2000, take me back there, because obviously that was almost impossible to call. What happened in 2000? Did you learn anything from that event and the closest of that campaign
Yes,
and result?
yes. After 2000, I was approached by the prestigious United States Commission on Civil Rights, and they wanted me to look at something I hadn't studied, disparities by race in the rejection of ballots in that very strange election. 180,000 ballots, get that, 180,000 ballots were tossed as invalid in an election that you point out correctly was decided by 537
Amazing.
votes. And what I found was overwhelmingly, disproportionately, the ballots that were thrown out were cast by African Americans who were 95% for Gore, and the majority of those tossed ballots were not what anyone thinks. They're not those hanging chads or dimples. They are so-called overvotes. Black people didn't trust Florida for good reason. The Republican candidate's brother was running the state, so they punched in Gore, and then they wrote in Gore just to make sure. And Florida tossed all of those ballots that were obviously cast for Gore. If they had been counted, Gore would have won by tens of thousands of votes. I proved in that report. It's still up on their website, and it was independently verified by another scholar who I had nothing to do with, Walter Mebane of Cornell University, whose article was entitled "The Wrong Man is President!" exclamation point. That's how crazy that election was. That's why I don't think I was really wrong, but we can relitigate 2000 forever.
Thank you for that brilliant explanation. It's amazing how even in polling it has become a huge argument between different sides, and as you say, much of it malicious against those who are right. So I will maybe reword that. Maybe you got 10 out of 10 of the last presidential elections correct.
Thank you.
But let's
Thank
look
you.
towards this year's presidential election. Obviously, the big significant change was the change of candidate for the Democrats from President Joe Biden to Vice President Kamala Harris. Has that affected the chances of the Democrats winning?
The keys fully take into account what happened. I was very critical of the Democrats for openly and viciously trashing their incumbent president right out in open. They didn't have to do that. I haven't seen that, and I've studied U.S. politics since the founding. I also thought they were headed for a disaster, that they would push out Biden and lose my incumbency key and have a big party brawl and also lose my contest key. No White House party has ever won re-election when losing both those keys since 1900. But maybe they listened to me, I doubt it, but they seem to have grown a spine and a brain and united behind Harris, which means they only lost one key, the incumbency key. Plus, the Harris nomination may have helped them with two other keys, the third party key. Voters didn't have to choose between two old white guys anymore. Hate saying that being an old white guy, but it's true. Social unrest key. Biden was the focus of the protests. He's out of the picture now. That, I think, helped fizzle the protests. So in the end, it only cost them one key, not enough to count them out. Therefore, the keys fully took into account and adjusted for this unprecedented event within the Democratic Party.
And do you think that means, or what do you think the outcome will be in the US presidential election? Because the polls are not able to call it, particularly when you go to the swing states.
That's right. The polls are inconclusive and they're all noise. They're all well within the statistical margin of error of 3%, plus the fact that people haven't focused, they may lie, and they have to guess who the likely voters are. So they're way within the margin of error. But here's where the keys stand. The Democrats, Harris, lose my mandate key based on U.S. House elections. They lost seats in 2022. Obviously, the incumbency key, the incumbent charisma key, because whatever you may think of Harris, she's only been around as a candidate for a little while. She's no FDR. That's three. The foreign/military failure key, because the Middle East is a disaster, a humanitarian catastrophe with no good end in sight. That's four. Remember, it takes six keys to count out the incumbents. So the key prediction is that we're going to have an unprecedented president, the first woman president, and the first president of mixed African and Asian descent, which kind of foreshadows where the United States is going. We're rapidly becoming a majority minority country. Old white guys like me are on the decline.
Mr. Lichtman, is there anything that Donald Trump and the Republicans could do in the short time available to them to change any of those keys around into their favour? Or is it set pretty much in stone where you think the election's going to go, i.e. to Kamala Harris?
The biggest myth in American politics is the October surprise. For 40 years, I've been making my predictions before that, and I've never changed them. And I deliberately issued my final call with the New York Times on September 5th, before the so-called pivotal Harris-Trump debate that the pundits were saying, is going to decide the election. I wanted to make it clear that it's the big picture of governing that counts and not the events of the campaign. So nothing that Trump can say is going to change things. Putting aside the keys, what I've seen of Trump is he's trying his best to lose, not win the election, spewing the most outrageous kind of nonsense time and time again. The media blasted Biden, and perhaps justly so, for being in cognitive decline. It is obvious that Trump is in immense cognitive decline, can't tell the truth, can't say a coherent sentence, and yet the media time and again gives Donald Trump a pass. I don't get it.
The public still seem, and I know your skepticism around polls, but the public's many, many millions of Americans are still very happy to support Donald Trump, and the explanation or the description of him that you've just given, for those of us not in America, it always seems remarkable that Donald Trump, given your description, maintains the support he does support. What do you put that down to?
It's really extraordinary, and he plays upon the darkest side of America. There are these tendencies that have run throughout American history: anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, anti-immigration. You can trace it right back to the founders, and he taps into that dark side. And unfortunately, the dark side is pretty significant throughout our history. And today, women didn't even get the right to vote until 1920. We didn't even begin to break up Jim Crow discrimination in the South until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These and anti-immigration sentiments, have been rife since the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. So I think that's really the explanation.
Looking at your keys model, are there any weaknesses that Kamala Harris has which should concern her if, as you predict, she does get into the White House? Are there ways that you would advise her about any weaknesses that you see? Which keys doesn't she have in her favour that she may need to turn into her favour, even once in power?
Well, what I've been saying for 40 years is we need to break the cycle of this commitment to the horse race mentality, with the election changing day to day and the pollsters keeping score, that we should have campaigns that are very different, that focus on vision and substance and build a mandate for governing. And that's my advice to Harris: focus on substance and vision and build a mandate for your administration, which will help the Democrats, whether it's you or another candidate, 4 years down the road.
And do you feel confident she will do that? Because some of the criticism of Kamala Harris has been she is policy light, she is substance light, and it's all razzmatazz and vibes, as I think Generation Z might call it.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a unique criticism of Harris. That's probably true, but Trump is policy free. All his policies are based on the most outrageous lies. 13,000 migrants coming in ready to slit your throat. All the studies show undocumented immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate than native-born Americans. So I'm not sure it's unique criticism. I think that's an across-the-board criticism of candidates. But I've been urging all candidates to follow campaigning by the keys rather than campaigning by conventional wisdom. And if you think about conventional losing candidates. Do we ever remember anything they've ever said? Hillary Clinton, Mitt Romney, John McCain, John Kerry, Walter Mondale, Bob Dole. I challenge anyone to remember anything they've said. But even if you lose, if you're campaigning by the keys, you'll have made your mark on history, like a big losing candidate, Barry Goldwater, did. His conservative principles to this day have influenced the conservative movement, as have George McGovern's liberal principles on the other side.
What do the keys or that type of analysis, what do they tell you that the Republicans should do if, as you predict, they lose the election? What should the Republicans be doing to re-engage with America in a way that will make them fit for 2028?
They've got to become a principled party. They can't be a party that's simply beholden to a single cult figure like Donald Trump. Doesn't seem to matter what Donald Trump does. He could betray the American people by sending short COVID test kits, of which there's a desperate shortage in the U.S., to a murderous dictator. Doesn't matter. He could be convicted of 34 felonies. Doesn't matter. I've said you can summarize American politics in one sentence. Republicans have no principles. Democrats have no spine. Democrats need to grow a better spine. Republicans need to develop some principles.